In November 1978, a woman locked up her dress shop on a quiet street in Rochford, Essex, and stepped out into the evening to run a simple errand for a friend. It was a sort of ordinary trip made without a second thought, the kind of everyday moment none of us expect to matter. But somewhere between her front door and her car, Norah Trott vanished into the darkness. By the early hours of the next morning, she was found brutally murdered just yards from her home. Police flooded the area. Witnesses came forward. Thousands of people were questioned. A suspicious man had been seen nearby carrying Norah's bag, and for a while it looked as though the case might be solved quickly. But leads soon dried up. Years passed, and the man responsible simply melted back into ordinary life. As the decades rolled on, it began to seem like he'd got away with it, until the science finally caught up. In this episode of British Murders with Stuart Blues, we're discussing the murder of Norah Trott, a case that lay dormant for more than a quarter of a century before modern DNA technology changed everything. It's a story of patience, perseverance, and the chilling reality that killers live on borrowed time. Before we start, just a quick reminder to follow the podcast or subscribe on YouTube. It's completely free and one of the best ways to support the show. If you're able to leave a rating or review, that helps enormously as well. And for ad-free listening, early access to episodes, and exclusive content, head to patreon.com/British Murders to join my ever-growing community. There was once a time when, if someone committed a murder and was not brought to justice for a good few years, they probably thought they were in the clear. They believed they'd gotten away with it by keeping their head down, saying nothing to no one, carrying on with life, and simply letting the years roll by. Memories tend to fade with the passage of time. Witnesses move on. Evidence gets boxed up and shoved on a shelf somewhere, seemingly forgotten about. So for plenty of offenders, that must have felt like freedom. But times have changed so much in recent years. Bit by bit, the science caught up with the crimes. What once looked like a dead end could suddenly be reopened with a cotton swab, a microscope, and technology that detectives in the 1970s could only have dreamed of. Tiny traces left behind at a crime scene. Things no one knew how to properly use back then, nor preserve, started speaking their truth decades later. Then came the UK's National DNA Database in 1995, and that changed the game once more. Names could now be matched to evidence from old cases. People who'd spent years believing they'd beaten the system were suddenly getting an early morning knock at the door, their pasts finally catching up with them. And thankfully we're seeing more and more of it. Cold cases are becoming solved at an increasingly frequent rate, meaning bereaved families and friends are now getting answers and some semblance of closure. Killers are dragged into court with grey hair and wrinkles and forced to answer for something they thought had been buried in the past. Today's case is one of those stories. It all started in 1978 in the Essex town of Rochford, where a woman named Norah Trott lost her life in shockingly brutal circumstances. For 26 years, her killer remained unidentified. No arrests were made, no justice served, just a series of questions which detectives had no answers to, until a combination of science, patience, and a national DNA database caught up with him. Norah was 63 years old in November 1978, that's when our main timeline started, and based on the research I've done, it seems she was a well-liked, respectable, and hard-working woman who'd built a life for herself in Rochford. She'd been divorced from her former husband, barrister Rochford Trott, for more than 20 years by then, but the two had stayed on good terms, which says plenty in and of itself. She lived alone on North Street, right in the heart of the town, and ran her own ladies' clothing shop called Felicity Jane. It appears she lived above the premises too, so work and play were both in one place. Hers was a proper old-school small business, the type where all the regular customers know you by name and pop in for a chat. Norah had basically become part of the fabric, pun intended, of the community. The locals adored her, and she, in turn, was loving life, looking forward to those golden retirement years which were not too far ahead of her. After years of hard graft, she should have been entering a quieter chapter of life. Instead, her story was about to end in the most horrific way imaginable. On the evening of Monday, November 6, 1978, sometime between 7 and 8 p.m, Norah closed up her shop and headed out to a car which was parked in a garage nearby. It may be that she was simply leaving her home rather than the shop, but we shan't get bogged down with semantics. Either way, Norah was running an errand for a friend, a task she perhaps did often, and certainly nothing unusual. It was just one of those everyday things people do without a second thought. Tragically, for Norah, she would not make it back home. Somewhere near them lock-up garages where she kept her car, in a lane beside the Old Ship pub on North Street, which was literally across the road from her home and shop, Norah was attacked by someone who was waiting in the shadows under the cover of darkness. She was tackled, stripped, raped, and left to die out there in the cold. Old Ship Lane was the precise location, running down the side of the pub. During the assault, a passerby heard some scuffling coming from the lane and called out, wondering what were going on. A man, the killer, then appeared from behind a brick wall and calmly told the passerby that he was there with a woman. The phrasing he used was that he was necking with his girlfriend, which basically means kissing or making out if you like. It was such a casual response, so cool and controlled that the witness accepted it as fact and moved on, thinking nothing more of it. Looking back now, it's a fair assumption that said witness may have wished they'd done more in hindsight. But in fairness, they weren't to know they had been just yards away from a murder in progress. At around 8:30 p.m, two 14-year-old boys noticed a fair-haired man dressed in dark clothing acting suspiciously near North Street, that was less than half a mile from Old Ship Lane where Norah had been attacked. He was carrying a raffia shopping bag, one of them woven bags made from palm fibres, which belonged to Norah. The two lads, sensing something wasn't right, followed him. And fair play to him, because most adults might not have bothered, just as the previous witness had opted to take no further action. But their chase ended when, get this, a police officer stopped them in the tracks. Why did he stop them? Because they were cycling the wrong way down a one-way street. So for all their goodwill and excellent tailing of Norah's suspected killer, they were rumbled by the one person they no doubt had been looking for, a copper. In that moment when they were stopped, the suspect slipped away, and as he vanished, he threw the raffia bag into a rubbish bin. The boys later recovered the blood-stained bag and handed it in to the police, which was something, but as we've covered in the intro, DNA technology was basically non-existent back then, so there wasn't much the officers could do with it at the time. Then, in the early hours of the following morning at around 2 a.m. on what was by then November 7th, Norah's body was found by a friend of hers behind the Old Ship pub. She was barely 200 yards from her home and shop, so she really didn't make it far before being attacked on that fateful night. There's actually a really haunting crime scene photograph which was taken that morning, I think it's a Shutterstock one, which shows police cordons in place at the top and bottom of Old Ship Lane. In the distance, you can clearly see the sign for Felicity Jane, Norah's own shop, eerily staring back at the camera from across the road. Norah had suffered some severe head injuries, with investigators believing she'd choked to death on her own blood. A post-mortem later confirmed the violence she'd endured, including the rape. Norah was found either fully or mostly naked, according to which source you read. Her clothing and possessions were gone, meaning whoever killed Norah had taken them to either hide the evidence, destroy it, perhaps both. Maybe the killer kept possessions as a trophy, as is common with many murderers. That is conjecture on my part for the record, but it does seem plausible. Looming over the crime scene was the Old Ship itself, a building dating back centuries with parts of it believed to stretch to the 1600s. As for Rochford, it's one of those towns where history seems built into every brick. The market at Rochford was established in the mid-13th century, and that's when the first evidence of settlement in the town centre dates from. The area has been used by humans as far back as the Stone Age, but on that cold November night in 1978, that old lane in the centre of Rochford became the setting for a crime the town would never forget. The hunt for Norah's killer began straight away, and Essex police knew from the start they were dealing with something and someone deeply disturbing. The initial investigation were led by Detective Chief Superintendent Peter Crust of Essex CID, and he made it clear that his team of officers urgently wanted to trace the young man seen near the Old Ship pub on the night of the murder, the same fair-haired suspect spotted by those two teenagers. DCS Crust didn't mince his words when speaking about the attack either, calling it savage and brutal. He said Norah's clothing had been ripped from her body, some of them torn to shreds, and warned that he believed they had what he described as a sex maniac on their hands who may kill again. That gives you a sense of the fear hanging over Rochford at the time, because this wasn't a case of a mugging gone badly wrong. This was a vicious attack by a stranger on a woman well known in a local community just yards away from the safety of her house. If someone could do that once, people feared they could do it again. Police searched everywhere they could think of. Officers armed with scythes hacked back undergrowth along nearby Stanbridge Road, looking desperately for the murder weapon, but to no avail. Tracker dogs were brought in to search ditches, hedgerows and gardens, but once more found nothing of note. Even the landlord of the Old Ship reported hearing a disturbance near the bottom of the garden and seeing a man on the far side of the wall close to Norah's garage. But despite all the activity, despite the urgency and manpower, solid leads were hard to come by. By March 1979, just 4 months after the murder, detectives were trying something you don't hear about every day, especially now. They brought in a hypnotist. Dr. David Waxman, a leading member of the British Society of Medical and Dental Hypnosis, aka BSMDH, conducted an hour-long session with a key eyewitness, the same man who'd heard the scuffling in the lane and spoken briefly to that calm, cool stranger, claiming to be with his girlfriend. The hope was simple enough, albeit an incredibly optimistic one. The idea was that, just maybe, under hypnosis, some buried memories might come back to the witness. A detail which may have been missed at the time, something such as a face or a voice, anything would do. As the witness spoke, an artist sketched the man he described. With that, the police had a vague idea of who their prime suspect was, and based on that sketch, he later became known as Babyface. Babyface was said to be between 18 and 25 years old, around 5 foot 10 inches tall, slim build, clean shaven, with a pointed nose and medium brown hair. He'd reportedly worn a dark bomber jacket, a light open neck shirt, and dark flared trousers on the night of the killing. And yet, even with a sketch and a town on edge, nothing came of it. By that stage, detectives had interviewed around 11,000 people, taken more than 100 statements, and checked out hundreds of young men aged between 18 and 25 who lived near the scene. They'd thrown the kitchen sink at it. That's terminology the detectives actually used at the time. Still, no arrests were made, and the suspects list compiled solely of a babyface drawing. The case cooled not long after that, before briefly being reignited in May 1981 when police received fresh information over a period of 10 days. Detective Chief Inspector Ken Smith said he and other officers would revisit the area of Rochford and interview a number of people as they pursued this new line of inquiry. But once again, whatever promise it held came to nothing. And so, the years rolled on. For 2 decades, it looked as though Norah Trott's killer had done exactly what so many violent offenders dream of doing: disappear into ordinary life after getting away with murder. But that all changed suddenly at the turn of the millennium in 2003. 25 years after Norah was murdered, Essex police reopened the case again after receiving an anonymous letter that year from someone claiming to have fresh information. The letter, sent to Southend Police in July, suggested the killer was from Ilford, that's a town in East London roughly 30 miles west of Rochford, and had been a regular at the Old Ship pub back in 1978. Then another witness came forward. A woman told police that just days before Norah's murder, she had been followed home in Rochford and grabbed by a man. She managed to escape the assailant, fighting him off after two passers-by stepped in, but it couldn't be ruled out that that same man had then gone on to kill Norah after failing with his first attempt. That's the sort of chilling information that suggests Norah's murder may not have been a random one-off incident at all. It suggested a predator had been prowling the streets of Rochford, waiting opportunistically for his next victim. By the summer of 2004, Essex Police's investigative review team, led by Detective Superintendent Simon Coxall, prepared to publicise 10 cold cases in the hope of finally cracking murders going back nearly 30 years. Crime Stoppers rewards of up to $5,000 were offered, which equates to almost double that in today's money, just over $9,000. Police said advances in forensic science might be the key, but that the public could still hold the most crucial information. Time so often changes people, and loyalties shift, meaning secrets can become heavier to carry, too much to bear at times. And behind the scenes, science was doing exactly what we spoke about at the start of the episode. The original semen samples recovered from Norah's body and clothing when she was killed had been preserved. Back in 1978, they were important pieces of evidence, but the tools available back then simply weren't sufficient to fully exploit them. Now, however, they were. The semen samples recovered were placed on the National DNA Database in March 2003. Scientists at the Forensic Science Service then re-examined the material and created a DNA profile for Norah's killer, which was itself then loaded to the database. At first, there was no match, which left the case as cold as it had been before them 10 cases were chosen and made public. Even so, just months later, a breakthrough finally came. A man who'd been arrested and swabbed in custody on an unrelated matter had his DNA entered into the database as part of routine procedure. Advances in the technology meant scientists could now compare it with far greater confidence than ever before. And this time, the database spoke to them. After 26 years of silence, Norah's killer finally had a name. And if we fast forward 3 months from that DNA breakthrough to October 2004, the police made their move. 49-year-old Wayne Doherty, a builder with no fixed address, was arrested in the Channel Islands in connection with Norah's murder. He was found in Guernsey, where he was staying at an hotel in St. Peter Port. Doherty would have been around 23 years old back in 1978, placing him right in that estimated age range of 18 to 25 for the man known to detectives as Babyface. He also lived locally at the time, but what makes his arrest even more striking is that Doherty wasn't some random name plucked from thin air in 2004. Police had actually spoken to him during their extensive inquiries back in 1979. At the time, he told officers he'd been at home decorating on the evening Norah was killed. After that, he faded into the background. But while researching this case, I came across something deeply disturbing from Doherty's past, something which happened just 2 years after Norah was killed. In July 1980, he was jailed for 15 months after abducting a 2-year-old girl from her mother's car and indecently assaulting her, though he denied the charges. The prosecution said the little girl had been left in the car with her 13-month-old brother while the mum went to collect another child. When she returned just 5 minutes later, her daughter had vanished, and she was later found crying alone on nearby wasteland. Doherty claimed he hadn't taken her at all, instead saying the girl had approached him while he was walking through Rochford and saying he believed she were lost. That incident happened around 100 yards from where Norah was murdered. Yet even that conviction, vile as it was, did not place his DNA on the national database. Because, as we've covered, that wasn't introduced until 1995, 15 years later. So for years he slipped through another gap in time, and who knows what other crimes he went on to commit in the 2 decades plus after Norah were murdered. It was in July 2004, the same month the police received that anonymous letter, when the start of Doherty's downfall began. He was stopped by police in Cambridge and arrested for drink driving. And as part of that routine procedure, a mouth swab was taken, his DNA profile was then added to the DNA database, and that was the precise moment the past caught up with him, because the semen sample recovered from Norah's blood-stained skirt matched Doherty's DNA profile. So detectives, after 26 years, finally had their man. Doherty was brought back from Guernsey and first appeared before Southend Magistrates Court on October 11, 2004. Just over a week later, on October 19th, he appeared at Chelmsford Crown Court, where he was formally charged with Norah's murder and rape and remanded in custody. In May 2005, at Basildon Crown Court, he entered pleas of not guilty to both them charges. By then he was a grey-haired man nearing 50, standing in the dock wearing a white-collared shirt and blue jeans, reportedly showing little emotion as members of his family watched on. With the plea hearing concluded, Doherty was remanded and the case was set for trial. On October 31, 2005, Halloween of all days, Doherty's trial began at Basildon Crown Court before Judge Philip Clegg. The prosecution's case, led by Martin Levitt, was a damning one. The DNA scientists had obtained from the semen samples matched Doherty, and it was stated that the odds of said DNA found on Norah's clothing belonging to another unrelated person were 1 in 190 million. As for the DNA found on Norah's body, the odds were 1 in 180,000. That's the sort of evidence defense teams hate seeing, because it seems so clear and obvious that their client is banged to rights. Still, Doherty's barrister argued the science was wrong and that the prosecution's interpretation of the DNA evidence could not be trusted. In his closing speech, Michael Walkin told jurors they would be gambling and making a grave mistake if they convicted his client. But the jury had heard much more than statistics. They were told Norah had been repeatedly struck in the face. Her attacker had stamped on her body, breaking her voice box in the process so she could not scream for help. He then raped her. It was savage and cowardly, and after hearing all the evidence, the jury unanimously found Doherty guilty of both the murder and rape charges. Only after those verdicts did the court hear about his previous conviction involving that 2-year-old girl, along with some other unrelated offences. Judge Clegg sentenced Doherty to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 23 years for Norah's murder. He also imposed a concurrent 10-year sentence for her rape. The judge described Doherty as plainly a very dangerous man, one from whom the public needed protection. He also praised the police officers and forensic scientists whose persistence had finally cracked the case after 26 years, saying it was entirely due to their dedication that the perpetrator had at last been brought to justice. And after more than a quarter of a century, perhaps those who had mourned Norah could finally feel some measure of peace. Cases like this really bring home how justice doesn't always run to a normal timetable. In 1978, detectives did everything they could with the tools they had. They searched fields, chased witnesses, interviewed thousands of people, and followed every lead they could find. But science has limits in every era, and sometimes the truth sits there dormant, waiting for the world to catch up. By the early 2000s, it finally had. The same evidence collected all those years earlier, evidence that once could only be stored and hoped over, suddenly had a voice. And when Doherty's DNA was added to the database after something as concerningly common as a drink driving arrest, all those years of silence came crashing down around him. Norah Trott should have been enjoying retirement after years of hard work in the heart of Rochford. Instead, her life was stolen in brutal fashion. While nothing can undo that, the advances in forensic science meant her killer never got to keep the ending he thought he'd written. And for Norah, for those who cared about her, and for every cold case family still waiting on answers, that is what matters. Thanks so much for listening to British Murders with Stuart Blues. If you'd like to support British Murders and get ad-free episodes a day early, along with a range of exclusive content you won't hear on the main feed, you can find all of that at patreon.com/British Murders. And if you haven't already, please consider following the podcast on your player of choice or subscribing on YouTube. It really makes a difference to the show's growth. Ratings and reviews help enormously too, so thank you if you've taken the time to leave one. That's it for now. Until next time, cheerio.